There are towns where history hangs in the air like mold-stained curtains, places where time doesn't pass but simply congeals, like moss clinging to the edges of memory. Keltorp is one such place. A small neighborhood on the outskirts of Stockholm, where the lake lies still as if it's forgotten how to reflect, and the pine trees rise like withered fingers clawing at the sky, praying for something long dead. If you ask the locals about the Faceless man, they'll deny it. They'll say you're thinking of some urban legend from the States, but their eyes will shift, their voices lower, and in that pause you'll find your answer. The story begins in October of 1994, when the trees bled copper and the Swedish sky turned a shade of winter before its time. A girl named Elin Sundberg, 16, was walking to Keltorp High School. As she passed the shortcut between the lake and the housing blocks, she saw a man standing still in the distance, no more than 50 meters from the school gates. He wore a long gray raincoat, head slightly bowed, arms hanging at his sides. Elin couldn't make out his face. She thought it was a trick of the light. Morning light can deceive the eyes, but when she got closer, less than 10 meters away, she saw the horrifying truth. The man had no face, not masked, not disfigured, simply blank. Smooth skin stretched where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. No movement, no sound. Elin stepped back, heart pounding like a funeral drum inside her chest. She stumbled, turned, and ran. When she dared to look back, he was gone. Only the dead leaves fell quietly in the morning breeze. You might think it was a hallucination, or some twisted prank by a stranger, but it wasn't the only incident. Over the next 3 days, 5 other students, from different classes, different grades, reported seeing the same man. Same place, same time, 3:33 a.m. Rumors spread faster than the northern wind. Within a week, Keltorp High was submerged in a quiet dread. Laughter turned to hushed conversations. Hands clutched bag straps with pale knuckles, and no one dared glance out the windows anymore. The school administration tried to kill the story, labeling it mass hysteria or childish invention. But fear doesn't need logic to thrive. It only needs one image, a face that isn't there. The only one who refused to accept coincidence was Jonas Linder, a history teacher who had taught at Keltorp for over 20 years. He wasn't superstitious nor easily swayed by panic. But something in the students' testimonies, their matching details, their emotions, their timing, made it impossible for him to look away. Jonas began gathering the accounts from every student brave enough to speak, and soon a picture began to form, like a forgotten statue slowly emerging from the fog, each line more terrifying than the last. Everyone who saw the Faceless man saw him at exactly 3:33 a.m., not before, not after. And they all described the same sensation, a trance-like fixation, an inability to look away, as if the presence itself was feeding on something unnamed deep inside them. Jonas stopped sleeping. A quiet whisper clawed at the edge of his mind, a language without words, but with unbearable weight. At night he wandered the lakeside paths with a flashlight and camera. He didn't expect to find anything, but he couldn't not search. It was as though he was being pulled there, beyond curiosity, toward something fated. And on the 8th night since Elin's sighting, as fog veiled the lake and the moon disappeared behind heavy clouds, Jonas stood alone at the forest's edge at exactly 3:33 a.m. His flashlight flickered. The wind held its breath. Everything was too still. And between 2 ancient oak trees, in the silence, a figure stood motionless, soundless, faceless. Jonas couldn't recall how long he had stood there. A minute, perhaps, or a lifetime. The faceless figure remained motionless in the woods, as though even the air around it held its breath, terrified of brushing against something forbidden. No footsteps, no sound. Just a hollow shape in the form of a man. Jonas lifted his camera, but the battery had died without warning. When he flicked the flashlight back on, the beam lit the trees for a single second. Then the figure was gone. Not vanished, no, erased, like it had never been there to begin with. But what lingered was a coldness that seeped not from the wind, but from inside him. From that night on, Jonas became someone else. He still came to school, still lectured with his usual calm voice, still spoke of the blood-stained history of Europe. But his eyes had changed, as if a piece of his soul had been left behind in the forest of Keltorp. Students whispered that he would sit alone in empty classrooms, staring at the walls for hours. Some claimed to hear him muttering in an unknown language, not Swedish, not German, not even Latin, and he no longer slept. One gray November afternoon, He walked into the school library and asked for access to old land records and maps of the Keltorp region. Dust-covered documents, untouched for decades, were suddenly unearthed. Among them, Jonas found a hand-drawn map dated 1902. It marked a wooden structure that once stood exactly where the school now sat, written faintly in black ink. Venthuset för de bortglömda, the waiting house for the forgotten. No document explained what the place was used for, but in the margin, someone had scribbled a single line, underlined twice, Ingen återvänder efter tredje natten. No one returns after the third night. Jonas began to dream. Night after night, he saw himself standing inside a dark, rotting wooden hall, surrounded by rows of cracked benches. On each bench sat a slumped figure, faceless, speechless, motionless, and each night one of them would rise and take a step toward him. The dream repeated itself with religious precision. Every detail returned like a ritual Jonas could not escape. He began recording everything: the light, the silence, the sound of wood groaning under invisible footsteps, the breath of wind pushing through walls that had long since crumbled. The faceless beings did not move, but their presence gnawed at his sanity, as if his own memory was being devoured from within. On the 30th night, the third figure rose again, but this time it didn't walk. It simply stood and pointed straight at him. Jonas woke in cold sweat, trembling, but something inside him had changed. It wasn't fear anymore, it was compulsion. He returned to the archives. Among a collection of wartime educational records, he uncovered the name of a student who had once attended Keltorp's original schoolhouse, Johan Ekström, born 1928, disappeared December 1943. There was no record of his withdrawal, no police reports. The boy's name simply vanished from every list. But in a stack of old municipal letters, Jonas found a trembling handwritten note from an unnamed mother, addressed to the city council. "I know you don't believe me, but my son said he kept seeing a man without a face, standing near the school gate every morning, calling his name in dreams. And then he vanished. No sound, no trace." Jonas clutched the letter like a bone fragment of the truth. A chill crept down his spine. Johan had disappeared on December 12th, the exact same period the faceless figure had begun appearing again in the present day. The cycle was returning, and this time Jonas was caught in its center. The next day, he skipped class and headed to the National Archives in central Stockholm, home to unsorted documents that had never been digitized. There, buried in blueprints from 1899, he found architectural plans for a temporary structure, a containment facility for mildly unstable patients, used for nighttime isolation when beds in the city were full. The structure stood directly beneath the current school grounds. It was almost midnight when Jonas returned to the school alone. The staff had gone home. The halls, once echoing with teenage footsteps and hurried whispers, now fell into a silence so heavy it felt alive. He walked slowly, past the trophy case, past the framed black and white photos of long-dead graduating classes. His reflection in the darkened glass looked thinner, grayer. Not quite himself? He had discovered a forgotten stairwell behind the boiler room 2 nights ago, hidden behind a false wall with hinges so rusted they bled orange. No student knew it existed. No teacher had ever mentioned it. Jonas brought a crowbar, gloves, and a flashlight, and though every part of him screamed to stop, he forced himself down the steps, into the dust, into the dark. The stairs creaked beneath his weight, wood groaning as though it remembered footsteps from another century. The air was thick, musty. Time here had stopped breathing. At the bottom he found a heavy oak door, splintered and cracked but still locked with a rusted iron bolt. Jonas pried it open with the crowbar, and the moment the door gave way, a gust of air spilled out, stale and bitter, like a tomb finally exhaling. The room beyond was not large. Wooden walls, decayed benches lined in rows, a narrow pulpit. And above it, nailed into the wood, was a wooden plaque carved with the same phrase from the 1902 map, Venthuset för de bortglömda. The waiting house for the forgotten. Jonas stepped inside. His flashlight flickered as if protesting. On each bench sat clothes, jackets, coats, children's shoes, neatly placed side by side, as though those who once sat here had simply evaporated. The room smelled of old wood, dried tears, and a silence deeper than language. And on the far wall, barely visible beneath peeling paint, he found names, hundreds of them, etched into the planks by hand. Some were dated, the earliest 1891, the most recent 1943. He raised the light again. And beneath those names, scratched deeper than the rest, fresh even, was a single addition. A name he hadn't expected, Jonas Linder. His breath caught in his throat. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. No one had been down here. No one but him. Yet his name was there, waiting as though it had always been part of the room, carved by a hand that knew he would come. He turned, heart-pounding, and started back toward the stairs. But the stairs were no longer there. The walls were closer than before. Jonas spun, flashlight quivering in his hand. The stairwell, just behind him a moment ago, had vanished, swallowed by the same blackness that now curled in the corners of the room like smoke. He ran his fingers across the wall, desperate to find the frame, a seam, a crack, anything. Nothing, just cold timber and the smell of rot and regret. His breath came shallow now, his lungs shrinking inside him. Then from behind it began. A whisper, not loud, not clear, but unmistakable in one terrible way. It spoke his name. Jonas, soft low. Like a child hiding under the floorboards, calling for help, or luring him in. Jonas! He turned, light sweeping across the benches. Empty, no movement, but the air. It was shifting as though the room itself had begun to breathe. The benches creaked softly. Not under pressure, but memory, the kind of creak that carries the weight of those long gone. His light caught something impossibly familiar, a small photo frame resting crooked on the pulpit. He picked it up with trembling fingers. The glass was cracked, but the photo behind it was clear. A class photo, black and white. A group of children, unsmiling, standing in front of the old wooden building that had once stood here. Their faces were grainy except one, the figure in the back row, the only adult. It was Jonas. Same eyes, same posture. Same tie he wore every day to class. He dropped the frame, heart roaring in his ears. It couldn't be. That photo had to be over 80 years old. He hadn't been born unless... The whisper again. But this time it came from all around him. Dozens of voices overlapping, echoing against the wood. Jonas, you were here. You never left. Then a sound. Footsteps. Wet, dragging, moving slowly behind the benches. He backed away, flashlight darting, too fast to catch anything. But he could hear it, closer, closer, until the light caught the pulpit one last time, and standing behind it, still and silent, was a man, in a gray coat, no face. Jonas couldn't scream. His voice was already buried in this place, taken before he could offer it. His mind reached for reason, but all it found was the unbearable truth. This wasn't a haunting. This was a loop, and he had always been part of it. Time didn't stop in the waiting house, it simply folded. Jonas stumbled backward, still unable to take his eyes off the faceless man behind the pulpit. But even that word, man, no longer felt right. The figure wasn't human in any ordinary sense. It didn't move, it didn't breathe, and yet its presence filled the room, pressed into Jonas's chest like a hand holding his heart. And then something shifted. The darkness rippled, and Jonas was no longer standing. He was seated on one of the benches. His hands rested on his knees, and they were not old hands. They were smaller, softer, younger, a child's hands. His flashlight was gone. The wooden room looked newer, less decayed, though still dim. The benches were full now. Children sat on every one, silent, heads bowed, and in the front of the room, behind the pulpit, stood a man. Not faceless, not yet. It was him. Older, tired, speaking in a calm voice Jonas couldn't hear but somehow understood. He was teaching, or maybe reciting. The children didn't move, and Jonas, the child version of himself, felt an emotion surge within him. Not fear, not confusion, but guilt. Then another shift. He stood outside now, the night air cold against his skin. The trees around Lake Keltorp were taller, wilder. The sky was ink black. He saw himself, adult Jonas, walking toward the school, flashlight in hand, but everything was reversed, like a mirror broken at the edges. The building wasn't new, wasn't old. It was wrong. The windows were eyes. The door was a mouth. And the man with no face stood at the entrance, arms open as if welcoming him home. Then, in a burst of silence that struck louder than any scream, it all collapsed. Jonas stood again in the wooden room alone. The benches were empty, the air was dry. His knees trembled, and on the floor in front of him, carved deep into the boards, was a single line of text. Du var den första. Du är den sista. You are the first. You are the last. Suddenly he understood. The faceless man was not a ghost. He was not a warning. He was a memory, a role, A shape passed from one forgotten soul to the next, and Jonas had finally become him. It was morning when they found the school doors wide open. The janitor, arriving first as always, entered cautiously. Nothing seemed broken, nothing stolen, but something felt misaligned. The hallway lights flickered despite perfect wiring. The walls seemed to pulse faintly under his gaze, as if remembering something he hadn't lived through. Jonas Linder never came to school again. Police were called. His apartment was untouched. Car parked neatly, no signs of forced entry. The only clue, if it could be called that, came from a maintenance worker who discovered a small passage behind the boiler room, a stairwell no one remembered being there. It led to a dead end. Brick wall, dust, nothing more. They sealed it without report. Weeks passed. Students spoke less about the faceless man. The nightmares faded, as nightmares do. But those who had seen him never quite returned to who they were. And on the coldest nights, when wind whispered through the trees above Lake Keltorp, a few claimed they saw something by the water's edge. A man in a gray coat, standing still watching, and if you asked them what he looked like, they'd hesitate, struggle, fail, because he had no face. But some said, those brave or foolish enough to speak it aloud, they recognized the shape, the posture, the tilt of the head. It was Jonas, not haunting the place, becoming it. And somewhere deep beneath the school, where wood rots and names whisper against the walls, a new line was etched into the old floorboards. All that is forgotten must be remembered by someone. The waiting house still waits, and the faceless man is never late. If you're still here, perhaps you were meant to find this story. There are more like it, hidden across Europe. So don't look away now. Subscribe, stay close, because the next shadow you see might just know your name.